You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, a podcast where I, Evan Burke, shake my fist at God and ask, why is wrestling? Why is that a thing? Now, normally one would say, just move on with your life. Why do you have to care so much about it? And I understand that. It's hostile. I don't see why you had to ask it in such a tone, but I get where you're coming from. And I think what's important to understand is that sometimes we have people in our lives that we care about deeply, and they make strange and baffling choices that you don't understand and you want to understand. So I have some very close, dear friends in my life who I've known forever who are about as dedicated to wrestling as you could get, either as a fan or as a performer or both. And so who knows where the line is between those two things. And I'm on a journey to try to understand why wrestling is a thing that one should spend your time with. So hopefully this podcast, if you're like me and you're like, I don't care for this, but maybe you'll learn something. And if you're somebody who likes wrestling, then maybe you can get something out of it. And if you're not in either category, I don't know what to do, because those two categories should theoretically cover all humans. And let's go for verification of that logical truth and or fallacy. Let's move to somebody who has a doctorate in philosophy.
I indeed am Dr. Ben Abelson, professor of philosophy at Mercy College. And two things that are not mutually exclusive, apparently, are being such a person and being a great fan of professional wrestling. And I am the embodiment of that logical possibility.
Yeah. Well, my name is Doc Diamondfire. I've been involved in pro wrestling for, I really need to get a start date, about a dozen years now. I've done a little bit of everything. I've done wrestling, ring announcing, commentating, worked in front of the camera, behind the scenes, and I'm here to provide that perspective. And we have with us Katie. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello, it's me. It's Katie Villa, aka Ref Katie on Twitter, and that is Katie with a Y. If you do not spell it right, you will not find me. So please, for the love of God, listen to what I'm saying. I have been involved in I've been a fan of professional wrestling since 2003. I've been in professional wrestling for 6 years. I've been refereeing for just coming up on 3 of those years. And speaking of refereeing, we have a guest with us today, someone very important to me and Doc. Someone I consider a teacher. Guest, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kris Levin. You might know me better as Kid Ref or Baby Ref. I used to be an official at Impact Wrestling. I'm currently with MLW, Game Changer Wrestling, and ICW No Holds Barred, and hopefully whoever your local indie is, them too.
All right.
That was good.
I think we've watched. Listen, Kris is a professional. That's how you introduce yourself in a professional manner. Thanks a lot.
I think we've watched.
It's my pleasure.
We've watched at least one of your matches that you refed for this podcast, and that the one that I remember was the Orange Cassidy Kikutaru IWTV title match from ICW.
Yes, I did. I've worked with Orange Cassidy a lot at ICW over the years, and he is one of my favorites because I always try to pursue professional wrestling from an outsider's point of view. And by that, what I mean is I once wrote a story on Bloodsport, the GCW event that's very MMA oriented. And interviewing Simon Gotch, he said that the issue with pro wrestling today is that everyone grew up watching wrestling. They grew up watching wrestling on TV, and those wrestlers they watched on TV grew up watching wrestling on TV. And it's so many generations removed from actual wrestlers that it's turned into such a weird thing. And that's not necessarily a knock on it. It's evolving into its own art form. And I love when you can take outside sources that aren't pro wrestling and inject them into the sport, because I think it improves it as a whole. And I think there's few who could be said to have done it better at any point in the history of this business than Orange Cassidy.
I mean, I will say, as somebody who, the idea of this podcast is that I am an outsider to wrestling, and Orange Cassidy is probably my favorite wrestler of all time. Just based on what I have learned. He's
incredible.
Far. Yeah. I absolutely think that he will if we are ever to have a like wrestler that is a cultural moment again, the way that like Hulk Hogan was in the 80s or something, whatever the 2020s version of that is, I really think Orange Cassidy is like has the potential to be the millennial Hulk Hogan.
We can only hope.
All of the positive things that entails.
He's the first guy that I can think of since I honestly don't know when, since maybe the Attitude Era, that several people I've talked to have said, I've never watched wrestling before or enjoyed it, but I saw this guy. What's up with this guy? As opposed to like guys like CM Punk, which brought a lot of people from like to the WWE who already liked wrestling but didn't like what was already happening. No, people who I have never seen wrestling before tell me, look, this Orange Cassidy guy, what's his deal? I might want to actually check this out if this is what the show is going to be.
And I don't think so. I appreciate your take on him being like a transitional star in terms of from one medium to the next, and I agree with you. I don't think Hulk Hogan is the best comparison. I kind of look at John Cena as today's Hulk Hogan, of someone who's a mainstream star and the face of a company, whereas with Orange Cassidy, I would point him out as being more like a Deadpool, someone who he breaks the fourth wall with how he works. And if every superhero broke the fourth wall, it wouldn't be good, and it would make Deadpool not special.
Sure.
And it's the same way. If every wrestler just did a tongue-in-cheek style match, it would be the worst thing ever. But if Orange Cassidy is the one person doing it, and he's doing it stellar, I think it has potential. Like Deadpool is for mainstream popularity, but I think it's a grassroots thing that's going to start out like with this cult internet following and build from that, just like
Totally.
Deadpool did.
I've never heard you make the Deadpool comparison before, but that makes perfect sense. He's meta. He's completely meta.
Yeah.
Like he exists outside the actual rules of professional wrestling. Like not like literal rules like reffing rules or anything like that, but like the rules of the universe.
The cultural norms, yeah, for sure. I agree.
Exactly.
And I think to Evan's point, like that's sort of emblematic of us as a generation. The way, Hogan was sort of emblematic of 80s Reagan patriotism or something.
Reaganomics.
Yeah, like just to be clear,
Word life, this is basic Reaganomics.
when I say millennial Hulk Hogan, I don't mean that Orange Cassidy is like Hulk Hogan. I mean that in the way that Hulk Hogan embodied wrestling in the 80s, I do kind of think Orange Cassidy sort of embodies the modern wrestling ideal.
Like he could bring the next generation of fans in.
Yeah. No. Okay. I get that. Yeah. The same way Hogan represented the cultural zeitgeist at the time. I guess you could say that for Orange Cassidy as well.
That's kind of where, especially because the balance between is the last thing I do, and then we'll get into the real meat of it. But the balance between like appearing not to care, but actually caring so unbelievably hard that you've dedicated yourself to being like the best at. I think that is something that really speaks to like anybody born after like 1980. So Kris, let me the first question, the big question, the thing that I ask with this podcast, that I ask of any guest that comes on: why watch wrestling? Why spend given all things there are in the world, why carve out the time to spend with wrestling as an art form?
That's an interesting question. The question I most often hear is, why do you get in the business? And I think the answer to that is the same answer to your question, which is I didn't have a choice. It's just you have this passion that you feel compelled to be involved with it in any way possible. And that covers watching it, that covers being involved, traveling city to city, state to state, doing whatever you can just to have your foot in the door and become part of that culture. You just don't have a choice. You just need to.
Yeah, Doc once described it to me this way, and it's always resonated with me. You don't join wrestling because you want to. You join wrestling because the voices in your head tell you that you have to.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
It's for most people, it's not like a really like objectively good idea to get into wrestling. And for the people that it is objectively a good idea to get in, a lot of them don't have the same passion for it, despite the fact that some of them become big successes. I don't think Brock Lesnar cares a lot about the booking of any wrestling that doesn't involve the matches that he's in, but it was a good idea for him to get in because of his skill set. That's the difference between him and like the guys, you know, hitting the road and putting up rings every weekend.
He tried his best to get out, right?
Right, he did.
He didn't want to be there anymore.
I think that any type of success in professional wrestling can be looked at as a Pyrrhic victory, no matter what way you approach it, because it does take so much out of you, whether it's the physicality that your body's put through. And even as a referee, I have so many aches and pains. The time that you have to spend away from your loved ones, missing vacations, missing birthdays, it takes a lot. Being in the public eye is its own horrible thing that I hate, but it's a necessary evil.
Oh, Kris, I wanted to, while we're on this topic, I thought of something funny to tell you. You say you have so many random aches and pains from reffing. About like 2 months ago, I started noticing that my right shoulder, and only my right shoulder, has started making like this horrible clicking noise. And I'm like, why is it only my right shoulder? Oh!
It's like tennis players.
It's so loud. You can't hear it like through the mic, but like if I do it and Doc is across the room,
it's like tennis
he hears
players
it.
if with every swing you slam your arm into the ground. Yeah.
When I was very still early into my professional wrestling journey, and I made the decision that I wanted to pursue this as a career, that was one of the first warnings I received from Jason Ayers, was that your knees, your hips, and your counting shoulder are going to be the first thing to go. And my neck hasn't been feeling too great either, just from, all the bumps and training and live shows over the years as well.
Well, it started with my shoulder now. It doesn't hurt or anything, but it clicks real
regarding
loud.
it being like a Pyrrhic victory, even if you make it, in one of Mick Foley's books, he observes that like by 1999, when he had been a success a few years, he had started making a lot of money. But he said if you take into consideration the amount of money he had made from the beginning of his wrestling career, which he did keep track of, then a friend of his that had been a ticket collector on the Long Island Railroad had made more overall. And the difference between those two is that within a couple years after that, Mick had to stop wrestling. His friend could keep taking tickets on the Long Island Railroad for decades.
To be fair, if you are a ticket taker on the Long Island Railroad, I lived in Long Island for 6 years, and you get into roughly as many fights as you would as a professional wrestler.
That's fair.
Possibly more. And then the people who are taking swings at you are not trained in how to pull those punches. They are large, drunk Italian cops punching you in the face.
And you know what? If you're a person who can feel fulfilled and their desires nurtured by being a ticket taker, then more power to you. That's
Absolutely.
awesome.
Yeah.
And
I wish my desires were fulfilled through ticket taking. My life would be much easier.
And some of us, you could say it's something wrong with us, or we just have a certain quirk or trait that we're fulfilled by watching and pursuing and being involved with wrestling. And it's its own form of mental illness, no doubt.
Now,
agree.
Wrestling exists kind of on this spectrum between, they call it sports entertainment, and it is sort of on the spectrum between sport and theater, although it's a little more complicated than just like a linear spectrum. But is it more one or the other for you, or are the sport and the theater sort of bound up together?
I think it's more theater. I think it's theater in the round. I've been putting together my own audio docudrama over the last few months, and there's been a lot of stalls and whatnot given everything that's going on in the world. But one of the chief points of research that I've been going through is Lou Thesz's book, and Lou Thesz, who we watch for this episode.
I gotta read that book.
It's credible, and it's available on Amazon and Kindle. And it's called Hooker, which is a reference not to what we think it is, but more of that old-timey, if you're someone who could be a legitimate wrestler and sink your hooks into someone and hurt them if they wanted. They were called hookers.
Well, we might say shooter these days.
Well, so
something like
Thesz would differentiate it. He would say you're rather a journeyman who is more of a performer, who might have some wrestling ability. You're a shooter who can legitimately wrestle, or you're a hooker who can legitimately hurt someone. And then there was a fourth category that we don't talk about often called rippers, who are hookers who enjoy hurting people, which is the basis for the podcast I'm putting together. There's a horrible, it's a horrible and it's an amazing story in Hooker about Lou Thesz's mentor, George Tragos, who was asked to take a fall one night in the 30s and he didn't want to, and it turned into a shoot. And he tore his opponent's arm out of his shoulder, and he ended up getting gangrene because this is before antibiotics were a thing, and had to get his arm removed.
Ew.
And the whole podcast is kind of about authenticating that and looking at gatekeeping. But I digress. One of the most amazing things in Thesz's book that I came across is that right off the bat, throughout the book, he's very wishy-washy. Like, he acknowledges wrestling is a work, but at the same time, he'll like talk about a match with Ricky Dozan and kind of talk about it in shoot terms as if he actually beat him. But then in the previous chapter, he'll talk about how wrestling, that the second a sport you start selling tickets to, it stops becoming a sport and it becomes a spectacle of like a theatrical presentation. It's no longer about the sport; it's about entertainment and money. And the goals were different. I mean, one of the reasons I brought up when I was asked what matches I'd like to talk about, I brought up Thesz and Lou Thesz versus Buddy Rogers from, I believe, 1950, was because
June 21st, 1950 was the date.
Okay, thank you. And one of the reasons I love that so much is because that was from a time when everyone in the business were mostly wrestlers to some degree. Buddy Rogers, I believe, was an amateur. Thesz is a notorious hooker. And what they're doing has more of a basis that's predicated on their wrestling backgrounds, as opposed to growing up watching people who watch people who watch people, you know? So it's interesting to see something that's less, that has less, it's less far removed from that. And why I also think this era is incredibly important is if you go back and watch wrestling from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, the overwhelming majority of it are guys who can legitimately wrestle and have little sense of showmanship. That's why when you see someone who had any sense of showmanship, like a Gorgeous George, it completely revolutionized the game because that was so alien to it. And when you go back, you watch these guys, they don't know how to, I don't want to say they don't know how to, they hadn't figured out, okay, this is how we bump. This is how you pace a match. This is the ebb and flow. These are the dramatic beats. And guys like Thesz and Buddy Rogers were the first one to really kind of codify that system that we know today. And, you know, back then it was very regional. It's like accents. You had different regional styles around the country that kind of started to morph together a lot in the 80s when it became a national product. So which do I prefer? I prefer to look at wrestling more in the theatrical aspect, but I think it's important to know that where we came from.
Sure.
A couple of points on that. In the comic book story of pro wrestling, where I get a lot of my very early wrestling history from, they suggest that Thesz, that being a hooker, or actually maybe being more of a shooter, was sort of Thesz's character. Like, he presented himself in a way where he was saying wrestling used to be real. These showmen like Buddy Rogers or Gorgeous George, they're phonies. I'm a real guy like the old guys, and I'm bringing that back, and I'm gonna actually beat them with my athleticism.
You know, Thesz, that was his character, but not in terms of like an on-screen persona. That was him as a human being. He was someone who came from that system of guys who started in the carnivals and guys who actually had to do it for real. And back then, they measured your worth and how much respect you garnered by how well you could handle yourself. At least the people in Lou Thesz's world, the George Tragoses, the people like that. So
Strangler Lewis.
Yeah, Ed the Strangler Lewis, his one of his other mentors. That's where they came from. So yeah, Thesz was someone who I think he from interviews I've seen and from talking to a lot of people who knew him personally, he could tell you that he had a lot of respect for the performance abilities of a Buddy Rogers or an Antonino Rocca. But if you really want to be on that top tier of who he looked at as his idols, it was less about that and more about those George Tragoses, those Ed the Strangler Lewises, who could really handle themselves. And that was just how he was raised in the industry.
Well, the top like wrestlers like Thesz, they all respected Rogers, but they didn't really want to drop the title to him because he was more of a showman than a wrestler. Not that he wasn't a very good like wrestler, which is one of the things that led up to him, you know, winning that tournament in Rio de Janeiro for the WWF Championship.
Right.
Yeah.
If only we could ever find the footage.
You know.
And, you know, New York has always been that way. It's always been more interested, just the territory and the region as a whole, on the glitz and glamour, the ostentatious side, as opposed to the legitimate wrestling.
You know, that's what we like up here.
And Thesz would travel through New York. He would travel through New York throughout the 50s, but he was never the drawing card that a Buddy Rogers was because of that showmanship. And, if you were to look at Buddy's actual wrestling abilities, I'm not talking about amateur wrestling or shooting. I'm talking about just being a professional wrestling entertainer and performer. He's incredible. His match, they call him the inventor of the high spot because he was the first person to, if not invented, at least popularize the idea of having a string of moves together to create a sequence like that. It's incredible. His stuff is incredibly dynamic, and it's not bad wrestling in any sense. It's just not as predicated on reality as someone like a Thesz would have liked to have seen.
Well, something that to me, one of the most interesting things about the development of wrestling as an art form is that 100 years ago, it is a carnival sideshow where they are trying to cheat you out of money by lying to you about about the match being real. And it's just acts, and it's almost like it stumbles into being theater. Wrestling accidentally develops a whole other branch of theater that had never existed before. And then, and then 100 years later, I don't know, we just watched the AEW Stadium Showdown, which I thought was absolutely incredible, but is I do find it endlessly fascinating how wrestling got from its roots to this, to a genuinely theatrical production with storylines and occasionally special effects.
And it's interesting how, as much of a natural progression that is over the course of time for something to become more theatrical, you figure out better ways to do things that are maybe safer. It was a struggle because even you could go back to the 1910s and you can see people, established professional wrestlers bemoaning how this next generation are airing too far away from the sport of wrestling, from its roots. You see that in 1910. You see that you could look up on YouTube right now an interview with Buddy Rogers that he did in the 70s, out of character. I mean, as much out of character as you could get someone back then. And he complains about how it's just too far removed from what he was. And it's just wild to think that, that's something that literally every generation faces. And it always is a silly argument to me that we're going too much in this direction. Is that if we ever listened to the people who felt that it was moving too far away from its roots, if we stayed where it started at, it would rather be in a circle, like a group of people with no actual ring, just on the ground yelling at each other to beat each other up, or it would be these 8-hour most boring contests imaginable. It's good that we're progressing as a industry and an art.
Yeah, there's a legendary match that took place around the turn of the 20th century with Stanislaus Zbyszko claiming nobody could ever beat him, and he faced the Great Gama, and who was supposedly undefeated. They were all supposedly undefeated, right? Yeah. But Gama couldn't beat him because all he did was hug the mat for hours and hours and hours. And if you put your chest on the mat, your back can't get on the mat. And if your back can't get on the mat, the guy can't beat you technically. And several hours later, they just called it off.
If you want to look for a modern correlation of that, I think you could look at one of the early UFCs when you see Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock, where these were two incredible guys who exploded on the scene, and they were two of the industry's earliest stars, and then they have a match together, and there's so much dispute over the rules, and everyone's so cautious that they're just circling each other for a half hour.
Yeah, they hit a complete stalemate.
The Inoki Ali fight is another example of that.
That's another one. The rules were disputed, and everyone was too scared of saving face and protecting themselves that they had to alter the rules. So Inoki couldn't even wrestle. That's why he went in a crab position and kicked, because he couldn't do what he was good at.
To your point about people complaining about the past, I always remember I heard an interview with Ric Flair where he said when he was young, one of his mentors was the original Johnny Valentine, and he would complain that guys would be running off the ropes too much, and that would make it look fake. And I always remembered that, because when I was a kid, and I tell people this, I knew what wrestling was the moment a guy grabbed another guy by the wrist and patted him on the back, and then the other guy was uncontrollably running back and forth. And I'm like, that's not real. I grew up in the theater, though, so that didn't hinder my enjoyment of wrestling at all. And before we get into the match proper, I did hear an interview with Thesz shortly before he died. 99 or 2000. I heard a few years after
I
that.
believe.
'02, and he died. Yeah. I think the interview was from 2000, and they asked him, he was very respectful to everything regarding wrestling. Like, well, what do you think of wrestling today? And he said, it all just looks like choreographed tumbling nowadays.
Choreographed tumbling. I've heard that before. Yeah.
He didn't go on and on about it. He wasn't ranting about kids these days. Just like choreographed tumbling. And then there was kind of a pause, and he was like, I do like that Kurt Angle. His stuff looks really good. And the interviewer's like, would you come back to do a match with Kurt Angle? And he thinks about it for a second, and he goes, no, I don't think I'd have a match with Kurt Angle.
And then he died, so it turns out he was right about not trying that.
Yeah, don't.
He's with Hobart
so
now.
Old. One time, Johnny Rods showed me a picture of him and Lou Thesz, and he's like, you know who that guy is? And I'm like, no. And he's like, that's Lou Thesz. And of course, it was Lou Thesz from like the mid-'90s. He looked like he had melted, and so I didn't recognize him. All the pictures.
Was it on the wall of Johnny?
No. Most of the people on the wall are guys that he trained with or trained. This was just one of his many, personal scrapbooks.
Right, he pulls out a wallet and it unfolds for just 7 feet.
Yeah, when the quarantine is over, I'm going to take you to meet Johnny because you think you're joking. Yeah. And you should meet Johnny before it's too late. He is a relic of another time. He's been in the business for 60 years, and he will let you know it.
So about this 2 out of 3 falls NWA World Championship match from 1950.
Tell us where we can see it, because it's not the most obvious thing.
Yeah, the Chicago Film Archives have a YouTube channel, and this is from the Chicago National Amphitheater, so it's part of that archive. But I wanted to say one thing about it related to your point about Irish whips, Doc. You've a very common thing in pro wrestling matches off of Irish whips is the drop down leapfrog, or AJ Styles does the opposite, the leapfrog drop down. And that it's actually what AJ does is very similar to what Lou Thesz does here. He does a leapfrog drop down, and it shows what the purpose of moves like that is, because it completely knocks Buddy Rogers off balance while he's running. Now he's actually running uncontrollably.
I love that. I absolutely loved that.
That allows Thesz to take advantage. And you see that happen with AJ too. But normally when they do the drop down leapfrog spot, they just keep running the same way they always have been, because people have forgotten like the point of those moves.
And when I said earlier that Buddy Rogers, they call him the innovator of the high spot, it's in reference to that. So that sequence of moves in wrestling is called the International. Some people call it the Universal. There's plenty of names for it, but that's the most common thing you'll see in American-style professional wrestling. If you go back to the Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat matches of the 80s, you'll see that they multiple times in a match will go to that same sequence of, headlock, send-off, shoulder tackle, drop-down, leapfrog, and there's plenty of ways you can add variety to it. But yeah, that was something that Buddy Rogers kind of innovated. And one time I actually wrote an article on it along with John Trotsky when I was one of the lead writers for Angry Wrestling Vet. And it's up on a blog somewhere if you Google it, the breaking down the psychology of the most common spot of all time. Like, it's something like that.
I remember reading that. That's very interesting. Go check that
out. I
out.
always wondered who was behind Angry Wrestling.
Yeah, I was one of the lead writers. I was the creator and one of the lead writers for a number of years. John Trotsky's taken it over in recent years. He that's Supreme League grade. He was a Pennsylvania area wrestler who one of the head trainers for the Wild Samoans. He trained Batista, Mickey Rourke for the Wrestler, and myself. And I sat down with him and we kind of broke it down move for move to explain where all of it comes in. And it's a really fascinating way to look at things, just to have an idea of not just doing it because you were told to do it in training, but doing it to make sense of it. And that's the greatest strength of this Thesz Rogers match, because this era, they didn't have this canon of spots and sequences and this is how you do this thing. They were literally inventing it as they went along. And they were just so good that they had to do it every night in a different city. So they figured out what worked and how to do it safely, and they just passed it on generation to generation. And I marvel at that. It's really something special from my mind.
You mentioned the shoulder tackles and how they're just figuring out kind of how to bump and all that. Their bumps off of the shoulder tackles are really explosive. And I guess they figured it out as they went along, but the way it looks in these matches, it doesn't look like those are very safe ways of bumping.
Well, they don't bump a lot of times in the match.
Right.
You know, they're not preparing to bump 20 or 30 times in each match. They want it to seem like, ow, this hurts. I got knocked over, instead of just boom, up, run, boom, up, which is what we're conditioned to as wrestling fans these days.
Yeah, and a few things are important. A lot of guys back then just didn't know how to bump because that wasn't something that they trained people to do, you know? And it was around this time that I think it started becoming codified to, this is how you bump. And the way they're taking those shoulder tackles are so nasty. They hop up, they get knocked topsy-turvy, land on their heads, land high up on their backs and their necks. And they do the bumps seldomly, but they make them matter so much. And I think it's important to note that during this time, wrestling rings and boxing rings are generally one and the same. And as Doc, you can vouch for, with Johnny Rodz, most of his school having boxing rings, they do not have the give that a standard pro wrestling ring would have. That's not a common thing that you found wrestling rings with gives until
boxing
much
rings
more
are
recently.
a lot harder.
I just remembered one time we were doing a show somewhere, and Cajun Crawdad found a boxing ring in the basement, and he's like, guys, do you dare me to bump on this? And we're all like, of course we do. And he goes down, takes a flat back bump on it, and you just see and hear the immediate regret.
Yeah.
Because there was nothing. It was just him hitting what?
One time I was on
worse
tour
than that
with,
powerbomb.
I'm sorry, go on.
No, not worse than that.
Not worse than that power bomb.
Not worse when PCO powerbombed Crawdad, Chris.
Like out of the ring.
Yeah.
Out of the ring, yes, onto the ground.
One more note about the match before I want to ask Evan directly what he thought of it before we really analyze the meat of it. There was a special guest referee here, boxing legend Jack Dempsey. And Jack Dempsey was a heavyweight boxing champion literally 100 years ago. He was a heavyweight boxing champion around the turn of the 20s.
I was like to Doc, I just look at him like, Doc, why is the ref so big? He's too big. Was that a thing? Were the refs allowed to be huge? Then he had to explain to me it was a former boxer.
Yeah, back then, what you saw with referees, that it was pretty common that most, if not all, referees were former or active wrestlers. Like it wouldn't be uncommon for someone to work on the undercard and then they come back and they referee the main event, or it's a wrestler that's long since retired and that's what they do. It was seen as a more legitimate way of doing things. Before we get too far removed from boxing, I just wanted to say really quick that one time I was doing a tour of Mexico with DTU, and anyone who knows anything about lucha rings knows that there's a reason that the style as a whole is more predicated on rolls than it is bumps. And that's because most of the rings are very old, broken down boxing rings, or sometimes they're even literal slabs of cement with a thin canvas over them. And every night for this 2-week tour, we did it was between 5 and 8 people each night, a scramble. And it would always break down towards the end to a waterfall, which is a series of one guy runs in and hits his finish, then someone runs up and hits their finish on them, on and on and on. And it would always end with me running up and hitting a cutter or RKO at the end. And with that, there's no way to roll out. You just start taking a flat back bump, and it's not that bad, but doing it every night, like on these boxing rings, these slabs of cement, I was miserable.
Oh, man.
I saw you do a sunset flip once, Chris, at one of those lucha shows.
That's something that happened, yeah. Lucha Libre is very predicated on bringing the referees in to get involved physically as part of the humor.
I like that.
Which is all, yeah, I mean, that was more common in the United States back in the 50s, too, when it was like just looked at as like part of the variety show, you know?
The psychology of the referee changed a lot. At the time, it was more like, you need somebody who can control these guys. Mm-hmm. And now with the whole, and this has been going on for decades and decades, especially in American wrestling, since you want everything to be larger than life and everybody to seem large, what you want are little dudes to make everyone else look bigger and stronger, as opposed to someone who looks like they can handle everybody.
Well, it's funny because it flip-flops over time, and it depends on the place. Yeah. Because I did a tryout with New York York in 2011, and all of the older guys who were running things like the Steve Kearns.
It's the WWE for Evan.
Yes.
That's what New York means.
Sorry. The Steve Kearns. The
It's
Gerald-
okay. No, I do it too. It's like it becomes such second nature to like just go into stuff like that. But well, one of the purposes of this,
Even though they're in Connecticut these days.
Yeah.
Well, one of the main purposes of this podcast in general is that like there are so many podcasts where it's just three guys complaining about Raw every week. And I mean, don't get me wrong, Raw can be really bad sometimes. But I don't want to do that, and it's predicated on the fact that you've been watching wrestling for 20 years, which a lot of people haven't. So I want to at least like keep the explaining going for people.
That's fair.
Who
No,
maybe,
that's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
who are dipping their toe into extended wrestling media and not just watching it. So occasionally, you can keep calling it New York, but I want it to be like for anybody that
No, I
doesn't know when he
appreciate that.
says New York, he means the WWE.
And when I was there, all of the guys of older bygone generations, they all said we'd like to sign you on the spot if it's up to us. And then it was a lot of the younger cats who were saying, you know, with the advent of UFC, we want referees who do look a little bigger, who can handle themselves. And anyone who doesn't know me, I'm not a big person. I'm 5'8" and 140 pounds.
I'm surprised you weigh that much.
Yeah, and that's
Up,
just
right.
that's the
that's up
evolving
from
nature of the
120.
business. Yeah, that's the evolving nature of the business. And, you know, not all companies feel that way. There are plenty of companies that love having someone my size there to make everyone look bigger. It's just interesting to see how things come full circle and back again every now and then.
All right, so
All right.
So June 1950. I looked this up. So the number one song on the charts when this thing happened was called "The Third Man Theme" by Anton Karas. A couple of weeks after that, Mona Lisa by Nat King Cole would take it, and then the juggernaut that was Goodnight Irene hit the charts and would stay number one from August through November. So that'll give you a
Goodnight,
cultural.
Irene. Oh wait,
Right.
come on.
So this is the lead up to the Korean War, I believe, was also
Yes.
Yeah. But Goodnight Irene would have a special place in wrestling history much later, becoming the name for Adrian Adonis's sleeper hold.
Mhm.
That's right. That's right. Over 20 years after this, I believe. 20 years or so after this. Okay, so Evan, yeah, this is by far the oldest one thing that
Yes.
we've shown you so far, and it's
By decades.
it might be the most different from everything else we've shown you, other than like that clip of 9 guys stabbing Zandig in CCW. So tell me, what were your impressions of this? Not only like early wrestling, but like it wasn't even that early. This early television production.
Okay. I'll start with the part you'll like, and then I'll move into the part that's going to disappoint you.
Sure.
This was definitely interesting, like on an anthropological level. I was surprised at. I mean, it felt like I don't actually know like really what the development of the style was at this point in history. It felt like it was just coming out of looking exactly like amateur wrestling and into a more a showier thing. Like they did some of those exchanges where they bounce off the ropes and jump over each other, and then one guy drop kicks the other, something that I recognize from wrestling. They did a few of those, and I was almost surprised, like, oh, that this has existed since that time.
The flying head scissors,
yes.
especially, were
See,
spectacular.
See, a drop kick then was fancy.
But you can tell the crowd is like, whoa, let's not go nuts here.
The crowd cracks me up for various reasons in this. Go on though, Evan. I'll get to that in a bit.
Like some of the holds, like especially some of like the scissor holds and stuff, do not look very engaging with modern eyes, because it really just looks like two people lying there with one has their like. I don't know. It didn't look like they were putting a lot of oomph into a lot of those holds.
That neck bridging that Buddy Rogers was doing to try and get out of the head scissors was extremely impressive.
That was very good.
My neck was hurting just watching that.
But I'm going to be honest. My attention was primarily not in any way, shape, or form on any of the wrestling, but I was just... This match is a compendium of bizarre... turned mid-century broadcaster slang. The announcer, it was like Joe Biden was the announcer or something, where
That was Joe Biden.
I thought,
Yes, it was. Dang, you nailed it, Evan.
I want to just like
The guy's name was Russ Davis. Let's
Russ
give him
Davis.
credit.
Okay, Russ Davis, the announcer.
It's funny because, Doc, you've talked a lot in the past about how women's wrestling at this time, the announcers were like very patronizing.
Yeah.
Toward the women, like, oh, isn't it cute that ladies are fighting? But he was really patronizing towards these men.
He was pretty condescending towards Thesz and Rogers too. I mean, it's a different kind of. There's a lot less harm, I think, that can be done. But
well,
yeah.
as opposed to the kind of pathos that announcers have nowadays, where they're trying to make everything that's happening in the ring seem like the most important thing that has ever happened. This guy is kind of like, oh, isn't this cute and silly? You know, like he's not taking the wrestling very seriously at all, which I thought was
let's
funny.
explore some key phrases that I wrote down. First, all right, so very early on, he says, "No, mother, he doesn't wrestle in that jewelry. He'd be a hard little boy if he does." Now, first off, this guy...
It'd be a hard little boy to wrestle.
Sorry. Let's just say, he says the word mother like 4 times throughout this,
Yeah.
and every time he said it, I aged 1 year because
He referred to Thesz's daddy as well.
yeah, a couple times.
Thesz's daddy is there.
He says there's his daddy, Tiny Man, alongside him, which this is my daddy, Tiny Man. Okay, at one point he says Rogers, he's sure been to Minsky's a couple times, which now that I'm saying it out loud, I realize, because I was like, that sounds like a really, I'm guessing that he's implying that he's gay, but I can't tell what that means, and now that I say it out loud, it's very obvious.
The Minsky's burlesque houses is what he's referring to.
I thought...
I had to look it up. Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's not
the
what I thought it was.
Minskys.
Yeah.
The Minskys were a family that owned numerous burlesque houses in New York City, and then after they got kicked out of New York City by Mayor LaGuardia, they set up shop in Atlantic City.
I see.
Damn you, that prude LaGuardia.
No,
Right.
listening to his commentary, it was almost the same sensation as, I don't know if there's any comic book readers here, but if you go back and read like some of the old Marvel stuff from the 60s where Stan Lee is the narrator and he's
Yeah.
using all of these timely slang that just doesn't age well. It just sounds super dorky. Like it comes off that exact same way.
So he says at one point he refers to somebody who's down on the floor with headphones as my boy Clinky down there with the tin ears.
That's fantastic.
When Buddy Rogers starts strutting, he refers to a song called Darktown Strutter's Ball, Darktown Strutter's Ball by Hoagie Carmichael. It's an old
Hoagie Carmichael.
ragtime tune, yeah.
Oh man, if we're talking about like just the aesthetics of it all, can I say just the crowd as a general rule cracks me the fuck up for a couple of reasons. One, they're all in suits. They're all just so dressed so properly.
They knew they might be on this new thing called television that only a few people still had, although it was growing in popularity. Yeah, Ben, you laugh. Like, I'm being completely serious. The first commercial broadcast was not 10 years before this. It was like, wow, they're gonna, like, people might see us. Let's dress up.
Oh, yeah.
Television was still very much luxury.
Pro
Go on,
wrestling
Chris.
pro wrestling on TV, that was a medium that was very new. I mean, that started probably around 48. So we're 50 here. So this is within 2 years of it just beginning at all. And, you know, today we look at the referees and we look at the announcers, and they're all part of this traveling circus of wrestling. Back then, a lot of not all of the referees were former wrestlers. There were times where they were assigned by the State Athletic Commission and they weren't in on the work. And the same with the announcers. This probably isn't an announcer who has a wrestling background. He probably just works at the TV studio, and they need someone to talk about something to make it palatable and understandable to everyone who's like, wow, what is this wrestling thing that I'm seeing?
That tracks.
Clearly, he had seen wrestling before, but it's not like he was, paid to be a shill for Lou Thesz. Although
No, he was just having
like
fun
occasionally.
I was wondering about the ref because Buddy Rogers is doing a lot of underhanded stuff trying to do it behind the ref's back. You know, he is the original Nature Boy, right? So
Right.
he was the dirtiest player in the game at the time, I suppose. But I was wondering, like, how smart Dempsey was to what was going on, whether it was possible that he might disqualify Rogers at some point for cheating too much. And in your experience, Kris, have you ever been working with someone who is cheating in a way that's like way too obvious to the point like you feel like you should disqualify them?
Okay, so to answer the Jack Dempsey question first, I believe that dating back to his active in-ring career as a boxer, he was involved with a lot of pro wrestling. They had a lot of mixed matches back in the day, which you would see a boxer versus a wrestler. That was a pretty big draw back then. And that's not just Jack Dempsey. That's something that if you look back to the turn of the century, that was a pretty common theme in terms of a special attraction. And so I don't know how in the know Jack was in terms of how the business worked. He was aware that it was a work and he was in on it. You know what I mean? He wasn't like thinking that this was an actual fight by any means. He had been around it for years. Just like Primo Carnera, he was another one who long time. He was he was the heavyweight boxing champion of the 20s and 30s, and he wrestled a bit, he refereed a bit. And to answer your question about people cheating in front of me, all the time. There's a phrase in pro wrestling called burying the referee, that when they just do whatever in front of you, and you as a professional, it's like most promoters will tell you, I want you to disqualify them if they cheat. But the practical reality of it is, if you mess up that story narrative or you mess up the show, they're going to be angrier at you than they, for doing that. It's a double thing. So I don't take it personally. I don't care if someone makes me look goofy, because I think everyone watching knows that is in on it, the fact that it's a work. And if you want to make me look bad, that's fine. But in reality, it makes themselves look bad, and it makes the promotion as a whole look bad. So I'll pull people aside and try to talk to them or teach them for their own benefit, for the benefit of the company. But yeah, that happens constantly.
Katie told us a story with some mist that
I've told that story too many times of when I was working in New York ND, and someone who will remain nameless decided to do an uncalled miss spot directly in front of my face. He got chewed out, though.
Mm-hmm.
He got properly chewed out by his vets. Yeah. I didn't chew him out because I didn't know the dude, but his peers handled that shit.
I was going to say also, the announcer tries to cover for some cheating, but by lying directly to us. Like at one point he's like, oh, there's no way. Dempsey didn't see that closed fist, and he was looking right at him and in fact admonished him for it.
Mm.
Oh, one more thing I wanted to point out about the crowd is they're you see this a couple times when they fall out, when one of the guys falls out, they're right up on the ring. And it's a very stark contrast to places like Beyond, where they're up on the ring because of the danger and the action and wanting oh shit, everyone's flying. Oh, Orange Cassidy just crushed my baby. Holy shit. As opposed to in this, it's clear that they're up on the ring because nobody's diving. Nobody's gonna fall on someone's baby. The worst that happens is a couple times someone tumbles out and everyone, very slowly in a way that everyone can move out of the way. And that's the worst that happened.
And, I want to point out a few things about the structure of the match that I thought was wonderful. And right off the bat, I think that anyone who is maybe not as familiar with 50s wrestling, or just knows of it as a trope, as opposed to actually having sat down and watched a lot of it, is that you're expecting a very slow, sluggish thing. And then right off the bat, they start the match so hot with a series of body slams and big bumps. And it's fast paced and exciting, and it's balls to the wall right away. And that really surprised and impressed me. Oh, wow, these two, they're not just going out there and wrestling and doing whatever. They really have the ebb and flow, and they're starting it out hot. It's something that they're paying attention to, which I appreciate. That just watching, whether it's as an artist, a storyteller, or even just as a fan, that they're working hard for this.
Yeah, the build up to the first fall. You have Rogers cheating over and over again, getting in those little headlock punches, and it sets it up for that crazy pile driver.
Oh, that crazy pile
shockingly
driver.
Violent.
Oh, that fucking looked disgusting.
Yeah,
in a good way.
And it's interesting. Thesz actually has a pretty interesting history in regards to pile drivers. the fabled inventor of the pile driver is Bill Longson, and he was having a program with Thesz just across the country as a brawler, and I'm sure Thesz took it many times. And you guys had mentioned a power bomb earlier with Grawdad. Thesz was actually the inventor of the power bomb. One night he was giving someone a pile driver, and they didn't know how to take it, and they leaned up, and Thesz just muscled them up and slammed them on their back, and that was how the power bomb was invented.
I believe that match is on the WWE Network. They have a early Thesz match on there where he does the powerbomb, and it looks exactly like that. It looks like it's ad hoc.
Yeah. To me, it's fascinating of how just an accident once. Like they say the same thing about the DT. Now, granted, people have been using the DT since the 60s, but in terms of mainstream recognition and people seeing it, the largest amount of people, the first time they became aware of it, it was off of Jake had a guy in a front headlock and he tripped and the guy took a face bump. Jake took a back bump and he just stood up and everyone was like, oh, wow, look at that, you know?
Jake was savvy enough to hear the crowd.
Yeah.
One other thing about the pile driver, according to Bruno Sammartino, you were talking about rippers earlier. Buddy Rogers was kind of notorious for hurting people on purpose, including with pile drivers. Like some guy had to have a steel plate in his head after a Rogers pile driver.
And, you know, I'm not saying that that's not true. I'm just going to say that there's a lot of times when guys say things like that, especially of that era, it is working. So they can keep up the illusion that, hey, you know what, maybe wrestling wasn't real, but it was a little bit more real in my day than it is now. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was Bruno telling a story, personally.
Bruno also claims that when he beat Rogers for the WWF title in 48 seconds, that was a shoot.
Yeah, I mean,
Bruno.
That's certainly, you know, I doubt it. It wasn't like a full out, like, let's fight. I think it was more of a, Rogers, you're doing business night or I'm going to beat your ass. And they did business, you know, like I think that's
Rogers was like, all right, well, if we're going to do business, this is going to be over in 30 seconds so I can go home.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of guys did a lot of things to try to stifle any embarrassment or damaging their name. Like Rogers said for years that he had a heart attack prior to the match, which if you actually look at his touring schedule, he was working regularly before, up to, and after that night. So it was just,
Right.
you know.
I think maybe not.
And that's a big reason why these matches were 2 out of 3 falls, because taking one fall in that match wasn't as big of a thing, but being the actual loser was a bigger thing. So they would have 2 out of 3 falls where you could have 2 finishes, and then the third, like we saw here, is a count out or a disqualification or a time limit draw. So nobody loses face and you can have that return match.
Well, that's how Vince McMahon Sr. and Toots Mondt were able to justify saying that Rogers was still the world champion after he lost it to Thesz, because that was only a 1-fall match.
Yeah,
in 61.
And they didn't, and honestly, the whole
63
reason
rather.
was because Thesz just wasn't the drawing card in New York that we were talking about that earlier, that Rogers was, that New York wanted more glitz and glamour. And Thesz, while I think Thesz was an amazing wrestler, I think he was, if you're looking at it through the eye of these are the first people to really add a lot of showmanship to it, I think Thesz was a incredible bridge between the legitimate and the straight showmanship. But yeah, just he didn't connect as well as Rogers did.
I want to know what other notes that Evan came up with in terms of stuff this announcer said, because I was listening to him the whole match also.
Let's see. One point after a failed throw, he refers to one of the wrestlers as hanging on like a brand new nickel mustard plaster, which I looked up and is a homeopathic remedy that used to be very popular.
Here goes Evan.
I'm sorry. When we're done
Here
with
goes
this, you're going to have
Evan.
to repeat that.
Everyone's
There's
going to have
this
to
thing,
say
Chris,
that
where
again.
Evan, some Zoom dies sometimes. He's going to come back in cursing.
Am I back?
Yeah.
Now I just get tired, so I don't.
He's going to be swearing.
So I'm sorry, Evan. Then I think you're back.
Am I back?
Say like 1, 2, 3 or something.
1, 2, 3. 1.
Nope, there he went again.
God damn it.
Bye, Evan.
So let's take it from
Yeah.
what the announcer was gonna say.
At one point, after a failed throw, he refers to one of the guys as hanging on like a brand new nickel mustard plaster, which
What the hell is he talking about?
so
I don't know.
No idea.
We looked that up. I'll do credit where credit's due. My partner looked it up, and she said that it was a homeopathic remedy that used to be popular, where it was like a mustard-based plaster that you would put on like a wound or something, and I guess it cost a nickel back in the day.
All right.
Shut up your old man's mustache.
All right. One other thing the announcer said, Thesz hits Buddy Rogers in the ear with his elbow, and the announcer says he hit him right in the cauliflower. I don't know if, Evan, you realize that he's referring to the cauliflower ear that amateur wrestlers tend to develop from many headlocks.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I have heard that expression before, so that makes
That's
more
the
sense.
that's the breakdown of cartilage in your ear, and it keeps rehealing and rehealing over and over again until it turns into this calcified mass.
Oof.
Yeah, a lot of old wrestlers have like, nasty looking cauliflower ears. It's not as bad as it looks, but it's not like good or anything.
Well, he does. I mean, the announcer refers to after Thesz has taken hits all over the place, he's taken a couple of bad bops in the eyeballs there, or banged him on top of the think tank there.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I
like that one.
At one point, Rogers, when he's doing the thing where he points, I got like two more of these. At one point, Rogers.
No, go on. Look. The fact that we showed you this, and you're like, well, the match was what it was, but the announcer said a bunch. That's perfectly valuable. If that's what people watch this and see is this announcer, by all means, give us all you got.
So at one point, Rogers is pointing to his head after he just won, I guess to imply that he is smart and wrestling like a smart person would.
Yep.
And the announcer says, "You use your head? What for? To keep that old cedar mop of hair on your head? I don't like him either, mother." Second time he says mother.
That's almost completely non sequitur.
Mother was a very at the time. Mother was definitely the kind of pet name that people would say to like their wife at home. Like if they had several kids, it'd be like, "Hello, mother, I'm home." Hello.
Or if you're Mike Pence, that's still a very contemporary thing as well.
Yeah, a lot of people are still doing that.
You'd imagine your mother being like, "Well, I don't like that guy."
Right.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't like him either, mother.
Of Thesz, he says, "Man, he slaps you with those big hands. You know you've been slapped." He refers to roughhouse wrestling at one point, which I'm like, the fuck is non-roughhouse wrestling? Like,
Back then, actually, it was instead of saying heels and faces, they would say clean or rough. Like backstage, that's how other workers would refer to it. So I don't know if that kind of trickled down or was just an obvious industry term to even fans at the time, but that's how they looked at it.
It's not that the heels at the time wouldn't like get a chair and hit you with it if that was the thing that was supposed to happen, but the fans, it was a lot more subtle in a lot of ways. Like the fans could tell that you were a heel because instead of trying to wrestle your opponent's shoulders to the mat, you were trying to beat them into submission. Mm-hmm. Instead of that just being a brawling style, it's like that was seen as less honorable.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one's at one point he says, "I got my store teeth in tonight." Which he doesn't pronounce something right, so I guess that he's saying like, "Oh, I got my discount dentures in." That's what that's a stab in the dark. I have no fucking idea.
That sounds about right to me. That's the only thing I could just make of that.
And then finally, at the end, he refers to, I believe, to Rogers, the loser, as being out like last season's codfish.
Yep.
So what they actually meant, Evan, was at the time, if you lost a match, you were actually sent out in a canoe to sea with no oars for a week afterwards, and you had to paddle your way back with your arms. It was the punishment for losing.
It's how you got strong.
They referred to it as getting old man in the seed every time.
And looking into the second fall of the match, we were talking earlier about the pile driver. I just wanted to bring up Thesz, the finish is he does a airplane spin, which now it's like the most it's a very campy style move, but back at the time throughout the 30s, Jim Lundos, probably the Golden Greek, the biggest box office draw of the 30s and up through the 40s, that was his finish. That was his go-to. So I'm sure that when people saw that, it wasn't just an airplane spin. It was a callback to Lundos as a performer, as champion.
The way Thesz does it, he has an incredible swing to it that I've never seen before. He doesn't just go around and around. It's like up and down. And then when he releases it, he slams him really hard. It's almost like, like a fireman's carry,
The wasteland
driver or something. I'm gonna say it's even more like what Santos Escobar does. Like into like a Michinoku driver almost.
Back then, what they did was there was no transitional moves or sequences. They were putting their all into everything. And that same trout I did years ago, I remember one of the biggest pieces of advice that doesn't even apply to me as an official, but just to wrestling. Gerald Briscoe was telling someone who had a rear chin lock in, he said, don't just do that move with your arms. You strain every single muscle of your body and put everything into it. And that's what we're seeing here with, I think, every single action in here. It's not, oh, I'm putting on the same rear chin lock that I see everyone else do it. It's I'm trying to wear this person down and defeat them with it, or or even the way they utilize the ring, the turnbuckles, the ropes, the poles. It's not I'm doing this the same way everyone does it. It's I'm standing around and looking at this as if I'm a newborn who's never seen it before. How can I interact?
Every wrestling instructor I've ever had goes really hard on everybody to get better collar and elbow tie-ups. And I watch this match and I go, oh, that's how you do it. Because they really look like bulls locking horns, trying to outpower each other in their collar and elbow tie-up.
Now, the finish to the last fall is like Rogers hits him with a series of shoulder tackles and then comes at him for one more big one. And as Evan has seen in a couple of matches now, much later than this, Rogers gets his head stuck between the first and second rope.
I always love that one.
And it's insane because they're building up the momentum. He keeps taking him down with these shoulder tackles. Thesz looks like he's about to be down out. Thesz does the drop down. Rogers leaps. He tangles his head through the middle and top rope the same way we'd see Mick Foley become famous for doing so.
Right.
And it's such a incredible feat of athleticism, of creativity. Just being able to do this at all is impressive, let alone do it safely. It's really an astounding finish. It's really great business because it doesn't make Rogers or Thesz look weak. It makes it look like a freak thing that happened. It's entertaining, and you can have a return match because it's kind of inconclusive in a way, but not in a way that's anticlimactic. It's amazing.
The crowd did not seem disappointed.
No, the crowd was really into it.
And it's made possible in this case by the fact that the rules were a little different than now. Mm-hmm. You could be counted out, I guess, just for being on the ropes for too long. You didn't have to be completely out of the ring.
10 counts were also much faster then.
Yeah, it was a real 10 count.
Yeah, and back then, that was kind of just how things were. I mean, this match is, if anyone is looking at the Chicago archives on YouTube, this match is the 36-minute long one because they have a few on there. There's another match that if that type of thing interests you, it's Buddy Rogers versus Haystacks Calhoun, who's the famous 600-pound wrestler from that era. And the finish is, I think Buddy hits him with the drop kick. Haystacks falls into the ropes. The top rope breaks. He legitimately falls out of the ring and he just gets counted out. And nobody looks bad there. Haystacks didn't get defeated. It was just a freak thing, and it's good business for everyone. It's really impressive how smart these people were to figure out how to book these in a way that they could keep coming back for more.
It's like Yokozuna falling off the second turnbuckle at WrestleMania 10.
Yeah.
And we should give credit to, the generation just before this, Strangler Lewis, Toots Mondt, Billy Sandow. They came up with a lot of these finishes that we still use.
Toots and his gang were the people who really got together and said, we need to stop having these 8-hour-long matches. They're too boring. And they made a concentrated effort to make that gold. They were called the Gold Dust Trio. And yeah, I think a lot of, obviously what they did was like it had more to evolve beyond that, but just the fact that he had the instinct to know this is how we need to start doing business, it revolutionized the industry. And it might have been the differentiating factor in saving it. Because if you look at so many other art forms of that day, burlesque and things like that, vaudeville, they faded away over time, and wrestling didn't. It wasn't a like the Wild West shows that just faded away and became a thing of history or like an odd thing. It stayed. That's how.
Another historical point, just to get it on the table, is that the NWA World Title was created in 1948. Mm-hmm. The first champion was Orville Brown. The second champion was Lou Thesz. And Thesz held that title on and off from 49 to 66. Buddy Rogers was one of the people who beat him for it eventually in 61. And then in 63, Thesz won it back, and then the WWF was created out of that and all that. But, Thesz was the standard for wrestling for several decades.
One thing that they did to really try to legitimize Thesz is that when you start seeing all these claims to being world champions in the late 1800s and the first quarter of the 1900s, you see a lot of different people claiming they're the world champion, and they all have their own reason to say that their lineage is the accurate one. And you see a handful of world championships popping up around the country through various athletic commissions. And Thesz did everything he could during those early years to have these title for title matches where he would have the NWA championship absorb the New York State Athletic Commission World Heavyweight Championship, or the National Wrestling Association, which was before the National Wrestling Alliance, their World Heavyweight Championship. And there's conversation on whether or not Thesz was the first world champion to be on TV. It's rather him or Baron Leone out of the California area. But he was in all walks of life a legitimate world champion in that term. As much as you can be in a fake sport.
Right.
Moving from somebody who was the definition, apparently, of professional wrestling and held that title for decades, we move to a man who, as far as I could tell, was not in full control of his body.
Mighty Joe Thunder against Steve King, who was the enhancement talent.
This is before he started writing.
Match.
This would be, and this was in 1982, was WWF television taping in rather Allentown or Hamburg, one of the two. And
I just want to know, does Mighty Joe Thunder know where he is and what's going on?
First, I think we need to acknowledge that Mighty Joe Thunder might be one of the best wrestling names of all time, regardless of his actual ability.
Yes.
Oh yeah, no, that's
Absolutely.
a great wrestling name.
And we get one of my favorite calls by an announcer ever in history. I think it was Pat Patterson announcing with Vince McMahon Jr. here. And he says, well, he's a big man and he's moving.
And, this Mighty Joe Thunder, so he has a really interesting history, which is the reason I had selected these two matches, because they play off of each other. And that is, he started in the late 50s and he worked up until the late 60s. And when you watch, everything about his style is indicative of what they were doing in the 50s and 60s. It was that undercard style of, whether it was the way he threw kicks or the way he threw his strikes to the chest or the way he did snapmares. It was very ungraceful, and he's a huge dude. He's 6'6", north of 300 pounds. He's older here, and he's not in the best shape. But it's not so much that he's bad. It's just so much that he's such a relic out of time. Is if you were to put him on the undercard of that Lou Thesz Buddy Rogers match, I'm not saying it was a good match, but it was a passable match. You know what I mean? That's
it got done what
really
it needed to do.
Yeah.
I had actually interpreted your intentions with this match differently, Chris. I thought that this was supposed to be like indicative of the New York style and how it departed from the kind of thing that Thesz did.
No,
but I guess you're saying that kind of style was already there.
It's what Thesz did, just nowhere near as good. It's someone who tried to do that style, and it wasn't an abject failure, but it was just, it just wasn't hitting the marks like Thesz or Rogers did it.
It's
Evan,
kind of like,
how did Mighty Joe Thunder hit you?
well, I will say that kind of makes sense that, like, if we're looking at the spectrum of possibility with this old style of wrestling, because he definitely expanded my conception of what was possible in terms of how bad it is to suck at wrestling.
We showed him Giant Gonzalez, so that's saying something.
because
the first comment on this YouTube video is he makes the great Khali look like Dean Malenko.
And
That's a bit of an exaggeration, but I see where they're coming from.
If you actually were to look at his all available research that the historical community's been able to find on this fella, he used to work as Bob Stanley, which was one of the famous Stanley brothers. He was like the fake Stanley brother. And when one of them retired, and he took a break from, it looks like 1969 up until 1982, which is why he wrestles like it's still 1969. He never evolved past that. He wasn't around to keep his style fresh and his in-ring game active,
A lot changed in wrestling during the 70s, and if you missed all of it, you missed a lot.
And another thing that I think
sheds a light on all of this is that he was actually part of the WWF back in the 60s. He worked under a few names, including the Golden Terror. He was there probably about on and off for cumulatively 3 years. And one thing that people will always say about Vince Jr. is that he is grateful and respectful toward the people who came before him. And just him being around, I'm sure he was around this guy back in the 60s or was around, and if not, he was definitely around people who were around this guy, like the Lou Albanos, and who was a wrestler at that time. And that's probably why he was given this shot of, you know what, he's a big guy, maybe this is someone we can feed him to Backlund, let's bring him in as a thank you for what he did for us back in the day and see if there's something there. And that's what I look at this as a project of appreciation for those who came before him.
And I always like those little bits of nepotism that Vince Jr. engaged in, like bringing Jack Tunney around to make, Frank Tunney up in Toronto happy. Things like that.
Yeah.
And you brought up Lou Albano. Like, you could get away a lot easier at the time with getting somebody of, like, a questionable modern skill like Mighty Joe Thunder there. If you just give him to a guy like Albano, who will present him properly and be like, this is my new threat, see? Because Albano's over, and the crowd wants his guy to lose. So then eventually his guy could, like you said, maybe lose to Backlund. They could, draw a house. And Albano, if it doesn't work out, if Mighty Joe Thunder doesn't connect really with the crowds, they can shuffle him along quietly, thank him for his work, give him a payday, and then give somebody else to Albano.
Yeah, and if you go on WrestlingClassics.com, they have a pretty fascinating thread of a bunch of historians who did a deep dive into it. If you type in Mighty Joe Thunder Wrestling Classics, it'll pop right up. And there's talks of how there was a program at the time to set Jimmy Snuka as a face, and they were going to bring in Mighty Joe Thunder to be one of the antagonists of that storyline. And when they brought him in and they saw that it didn't work, they ended up rearranging it a bit. But to me, it's just fascinating, all of that. Like Vince Sr. even, it said that back in the day when an older worker who had long since retired, if he showed up at the venue and just sat in the locker room, that Vince Sr. would just give him an envelope of a payday. And it's like, obviously we don't have any retirement fund or anything like that in pro wrestling, but it's cool to see that despite everything that you may hear about the McMahon family or whatever, that they do have appreciation, and they did show that by taking care of the older guys who were put out to pasture.
All right, I think that is a fantastic place to wrap it for today. Kris, man, I really appreciate you coming on. Your encyclopedic knowledge of wrestling astounds me, even after knowing Ben and Doc for so long.
Chris is actually a wrestling historian, not just a really big fan and somebody who's been in wrestling.
Chris knows
Chris
too much.
Sits down and studies this properly, and I think that's great.
Especially since I think you're quite a bit younger than us. So.
Yeah, you're what, 27 now?
28 and at the end of the month, but yes.
Okay.
27 now. Yeah, you got.
He's 17 years old, everybody.
You got most of your life ahead of you, kid. The only thing I want to say is that I was in the locker room with Chris once where he had already been in the business for 11 or 12 years, and somebody came in from the athletic commission to check his age. He had already been wrestling on television at this point, so that was ridiculous. But the promoter did end up having to pay for that age check. So that's the story.
Literally, that was all the commission did that day. They came in, looked around, checked Chris's ID, and left.
There were
I
very
was there
few
too.
people in that locker room who have more experience in wrestling than you, Chris. You were one of the serious veterans of that locker room.
And it doesn't bother me at all. I can't control my genetics of having a baby face. And as much as I feared early on in my career that looking young would hurt my my ability to be an authoritative official, but by now it's almost made my career with the whole kid ref thing taking off and all that. So I'm happy with it.
I'm really astonished that you were the Angry Wrestling vet. That was like 10 years ago.
Yeah, that was something I created with.
You were a literal child.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And yet already a grizzled vet.
So if you have stuff to plug, now's the time to do it.
Sure. You can find me on social media at ref Kris Levin, and that's Chris with a K because my parents are difficult. And when I'm not traveling and doing indie shows or doing schoolwork, I'm going to UMass for journalism. You can find me. I'm putting together my own audio docudrama. I mentioned it before. It's called Tales from the Mat, and you can find that on social media at From the Mat Tales because someone else already took Tales from the Mat on Instagram and Twitter. Whatever.
Oh,
Yeah, and and yeah, I'm the first episode. It's being produced right now. We have a lot of great guest stars who are going to be involved with it, including Dasher Hatfield, Still Life with Apricots and Pears, Anthony Green, who are going to lend their voice acting talents, and we also have interviews with Gerald Briscoe, Dr. Tom Pritchard, and a few other surprises that we're still putting together.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Sounds great.
so everyone give that a look.
Excited for that.
This has been Contesting Wrestling. Follow us on Twitter at ContestingW. Check out our Patreon where we post bonus episodes every week at patreon.com/contestingwrestling. Thank you, and we love you.
We
Good
love
night.
you. Bye.